The Gunslinger, a fighter subclass built around firearms, created by Matthew Mercer and famously played by Taliesin Jaffe, the Gunslinger is a force on the battlefield. With its arsenal of trick shots, a Gunslinger can be flashy as it carves its way through its enemies. So, if you want to become John Wick in your next D&D game, I suggest you play the Gunslinger. This guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions. I won't be going over basic subclass information because you can probably read. I've either played or DM'd for all the fighter subclasses, and my opinions almost certainly won't align with the D&D community at large. I will be ranking the subclass based on 5 criteria. I will be scrutinizing subclass features gotten at later levels more intensely, because most players aren't going to make it past 10th level with a character, so my analysis is weighted more towards earlier subclass features. With all that out of the way, let's begin. When talking about the Gunslinger, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the robust firearm rules that it comes with. If you want better rules for guns than what's found in the DMG, these will do nicely. That's not to say these are the best rules for firearms, but they're decent. The firearm types provided have added damage, but they come with major drawbacks like decreased weapon range, increased ammunition cost, and misfire rules. Essentially, every gun has a misfire score. If you roll the misfire score or lower on a weapon attack, the gun is going to jam or break. This is a huge drawback when we look at these firearms, and is the main mechanism used to balance their increased damage. Aside from the additional gun rules though, the Gunslinger has access to its trick shots. Stemming from its Adept Marksman feature, this is a fun mechanic that is better implemented than arcane shots for the Arcane Archer. Each trick shot is a thematic addition to a firearm attack. There are 8 total trick shots a part of this subclass, and you can learn 6 of them by 18th level. This is actually pretty fair if you're in a campaign where the DM knows that their players are going to 20th level. However, for modern Dungeons & Dragons, you could probably get away with learning 3 trick shots at the start to match the Battlemaster fighter. If you're looking for trick shot recommendations, may I point you to Violent and Dazing Shot. Violent Shot allows you to add more damage to your attacks, and Dazing Shot is great for defensive reasons. On a failed Constitution save, an enemy will have disadvantage on their attacks, which is decent, and can really help your frontline marshals. Now, if you're wanting to play a variant human and pick up Sharpshooter, you can also look at Deadeye. This is going to give you advantage on an attack roll and make your Sharpshooter all the more effective. But thus far I've neglected talking about grit points, which is what you spend in order to use your trick shots. And I think grit points are a huge benefit of this subclass, and it puts it above other subclasses like the Arcane Archer. You have a number of grit points equal to your wisdom modifier that you get back on a short or long rest automatically. However, you can get these points back in other ways. Number 1, if you roll a 20 on an attack roll, you get a grit point back. This subclass makes every critical hit feel better and more impactful. Not only are you getting extra damage, but you're refreshing one of your core subclass features. But number 2, you get a grit point back if you kill a creature of significant threat. It is up to the DM's discretion of what a creature of significant threat looks like. Now, I am personally a fan of systems that allow DMs to be the arbiter of gray areas. Let the DM interpret the rules to best fit their table or game. Now in this case, I tend to rule that creatures in combat with their own initiative order are significant threats. But I feel like this also changes level to level, because at lower levels, a goblin can be a significant threat to an adventurer. But when you're at 10th level, sorry, you gotta be taking down bugbears to get grit points back, which I think is fair. You or your dungeon master can adjust the ruling to fit your game. If a gunslinger is being outperformed by a ranger, maybe every enemy yields a grit point, allowing the gunslinger to constantly be firing off trick shots. Or if the veteran gunslinger is outperforming a party of new players, a creature of significant threat might truly be a boss monster or something of that level. I think the ambiguity is a huge strength. This system is also great when you realize that it encourages gunslingers to not hoard their grit points. Actually, you always need to be spending grit points and not keep them topped off in case you get a critical hit or kill a creature of significant threat. It's a really subtle feature about this subclass that I personally really enjoy. Now, the wisdom modifier being used for grit points can be a little bit limiting sometimes. However, you can rock with a lower constitution at the start or just wait for all your additional ASIs to come in. By 6th level, you can have an 18 in dex, a 16 in wisdom, and a 14 in constitution for an all-around solid build. Depending on the game and DM, you might get significantly more uses out of 3 grit points than a Battle Master fighter would out of like 5 superiority dice. Because depending on your own tactics and the luck within a game, you can just keep on refreshing your grit points, which is a fantastic feeling. And at the end of the day, you can be a gunslinger with this subclass. You're given the mechanical tools to do so. You will have to take risks and go for broke sometimes, but isn't that what a gunslinger does? Sometimes everything hinges on one bullet. And actually, let's start talking about concepts. When we say the word gunslinger, what are we imagining? Well, probably a Western sheriff or outlaw going full Clint Eastwood. And I think that is the most obvious archetype for this subclass to fall into. With your grit points and subclass features like quick draw or lightning reload, it just gives a spaghetti Western outlaw feel to it. Or you could go down the inventor route, because this subclass gives you access to things like Tinker's Tools proficiency. You're going to be building your own firearms and constructing your own ammunition. You might just be a genius that is constructing all of these weapons. But whatever the case, you're bold. The way you fight is flashy, loud, and draws a crowd. Just look at your core feature, trick shots. Think about playing up the boldness of your character. Because even a brooding character like John Wick is still incredibly flashy when he's using his firearms. So if you decide to play a gunslinger, think about how you stand out either with your dress, your fighting style, attitude, or all of the above. Now though, we can start getting into multiclassing. And I think there are 2 prime candidates for multiclassing a gunslinger, either a rogue or a ranger. Firstly, the expertise of a rogue gives this subclass some much needed utility. But many of the rogue subclasses also pair incredibly well with the gunslinger. The assassin rogue comes to mind. Your ability to get advantage on attacks by going first in combat synergizes with your quick draw ability in the gunslinger subclass. There's also synergy regarding critical hits, meaning that an assassin rogue gunslinger can have these massive first rounds of combat and replenish depleted grit points. Although this isn't very consistent, but it is fun. Other rogue subclasses like the Skirmisher allow you to stay out of melee range with enemies, and a subclass like the Inquisitive Rogue pairs well with Wisdom. Using insightful fighting, you can get advantage and sneak attack with a bonus action. And yeah, it might seem a little bit weird, but you can get sneak attack with firearms, despite how loud and flashy they are. However, we can also look to another class like the Ranger. The wisdom requirement of the Ranger pairs well with the Gunslinger. The class provides extra damage on your firearms attacks, which is nice. Plus, it's giving you more utility in a plethora of great subclass options that pair really well with a Gunslinger. A personal favorite of mine is the Hunter Ranger subclass paired with a Gunslinger. Taking the Horde Breaker option is just so clean. It is akin to fanning the hammer into a crowd of enemies. And more attacks equals more chances for crits and more grit points in the end. The Swarmkeeper Ranger is also great. You have the option of doing 1d6 extra damage, throwing an enemy back 15 feet, or taking a free disengage action to get out of melee range. Wow, that is absolutely fantastic for a gunslinger and offers you so much versatility in any number of situations. And yes, obviously the Gloomstalker is great too. It's the best ranger subclass. Seriously, on top of extra damage, you can easily have a plus 10 to initiative by 10th level with taking a few levels into Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker is great, what else do you want me to say? But really, multi-classing after 8th level with a gunslinger is a solid option because you don't really need any more than 8 levels in this subclass usually. And I think this is where we can begin to transition into some dislikes of the subclass. And firstly, the later level abilities are kind of mid. They're not really adding a lot. They're kind of made up for by getting some extra trick shots, but after 7th level, I'm incredibly underwhelmed by the Gunslinger's abilities. Additionally, this subclass is really multi-ability score dependent. Just base, you need Dexterity, Constitution, Wisdom, and Intelligence to make this subclass operate at full capacity. I still don't know why they didn't make grit points scale off of Constitution, because the word grit just makes me think of Constitution, right? So sometimes when playing a gunslinger, you just feel like your ability scores are spread a bit too thin. And this is really a problem for the gunslinger because the base subclass gives almost zero utility. You're not getting useful features to help you outside of combat. Proficiency in Tinker's Tools is nice, but it is highly DM dependent. It also costs money to make things in most campaigns, and you're going to be depleting your money to fix your guns and to create new ammunition. So will you really have time to be constructing all these new inventions, especially if you have like a +1 to intelligence? Probably not. Now, there is a trick shot called Bullying Shot, but you have other better trick shots you can take. And do you really want to be firing your gun randomly to gain advantage on intimidation checks, burning through your expensive ammunition, and potentially drawing unwanted attention from the law? I don't. Then we also need to touch on misfiring, because misfiring with a gun feels bad and punishes higher level fighters. More attacks means more opportunities for misfires. This means a gunslinger is best optimized at earlier levels when the fighter is making less attacks, because as the levels go up, you're going to be encountering more misfires. Which is weird, right? You would think a higher level gunslinger would have fewer misfires. Look, imagine if you were a warlock with Eldritch Blast, but every time you rolled below a 3 on your Eldritch Blast, your warlock patron completely shut off your powers until you successfully appease them again. That is essentially what a gunslinger fighter is dealing with. Misfire is not crippling, but it sure is fucking annoying. And finally, you have to have a DM and a player that buy into the mechanics and understand the intricacies of this subclass. Both DM and player have to understand the firearm rules. They have to understand the limitations of this subclass. Grit points must properly be doled out, else the gunslinger tends to fall behind. There are so many factors in each individual campaign that heavily contribute to this subclass. More than any other official fighter subclass that I've seen, the gunslinger requires a session 0 so that the DM and the player can get on the same page. Just understanding how your own personal DM looks at grit points is going to radically change your experiences with a gunslinger. In most situations, if the gunslinger isn't getting these extra grit points, it kind of feels off. This is a mistake I made early on when running gunslingers. I did not properly give out grit points and it hurt the subclass as a whole. Now, I made sure my gunslingers had other items to compensate for this, but I did not do this subclass justice when I first started DMing, because those two little words, DM discretion, impact this subclass so much. This is something I wish I was told when I first started running for gunslingers. So please take this advice to heart, and if you are considering playing a gunslinger, have that session 0 where you hash out all your expectations and get on the same page with your DM. I promise you it's going to make your experience so much better. But now, on to the ratings. 5 ratings here: roleplay, offensive, defensive utility, and X Factor. X Factor being what sets this particular fighter subclass apart from all the rest. As for roleplaying, I'm giving this subclass a 15 out of 20. The subclass has a clear archetype, but it doesn't work in every campaign. I dock points here because I wish this subclass and its mechanics didn't specify firearms. It'd be way more interesting if it was any ranged weapon attack. But this is an Exandrian subclass, so it makes sense. Just like the Warforged fits in Eberron, but not in every campaign. Now, when we talk about the offensive rating for this subclass, it's tough. If your DM is stingy with giving out grit points, it's a 13 out of 20. Your trick shots are strong, but you're not going to be using a lot of them. However, if you can pick off smaller enemies and get grit points back, and have access to more short rests, it's a 16 out of 20. You can really snowball on your turns in combat, and just start destroying enemies and rolling their deaths into more grit points. These trick shots like Violent Shot can significantly raise your DPS. Even things like Deadeye paired with Sharpshooter can work wonders. This is not to mention the added damage that comes along with Exandrian firearms. However, the misfire mechanic really does hold back this subclass, along with the amount of grit points you have access to being so luck and DM dependent. As for the defensive category, I'm giving this subclass a 13 out of 20. It actually has some solid enemy movement abilities. Disarming and Forceful Shot can make you feel like a battlefield controller. Plus, additional trick shots like Dazing and Winging Shot further help limit enemies' effectiveness and increase the offensive capacities of your allies. A gunslinger, if they're set up on Overwatch and have access to these particular shots, can really lock down a battlefield. As for utility, this subclass is a 5. Tinker's tools are nice, but your subclass is going to be multi-ability score dependent. You're just spread so thin that apart from dexterity skills, you're not really going to be able to pull your weight outside of combat. And even then, if you have a rogue or a monk in the party, they're going to do a way better job than you. Bullying Shot is an option if you want to increase your intimidation checks, but your charisma is probably not going to be high at all, and it's not really an option until higher levels, because it's going to be likely that you're going to take other trick shots before Bullying Shot. Even then, it's not great if you have a -1 or a +0 to charisma. Basically, you have 0 utility here. As for X Factor, when I'm looking at grit points and trick shots, I'm giving it a 16 out of 20. I think the Gunslinger's grit points are well designed for the most part. They're able to fit in most campaigns. Now I wish they didn't scale off of wisdom, and I know that these firearm rules can rub people the wrong way. You have two large camps that say either they're completely broken or supremely underpowered, and I think it's just very campaign and DM dependent. But this subclass does set itself apart well though, and in the right campaign with a DM that knows how to distribute these grit points, you're gonna have a good time. In this way, I kind of view the Gunslinger as a cousin to the Wild Magic Sorcerer. It's very DM dependent on when you get to roll a Wild Magic Surge, and it's very DM dependent when you get your grit points back. However, at the end of the day, I think that this subclass at its absolute best is a 65 out of 100. It's an average to above average subclass, but overall really solid. At the time of its creation, the Gunslinger was as good, if not better, than the other fighter subclasses. It has been power crept by Matt Mercer's own creations like the Echo Knight since then. However, with the right DM and in the right campaign, you can feel like this Western Gunslinger mowing down your enemies while firing off these crazy trick shots. Now, if you're looking for a subclass that can play this Gunslinger type perhaps better than an actual Gunslinger, check out this video right here. You have more options when it comes to ranged attacks and ranged attack types, and some pretty solid utility backing you up. But thank you for entering the dungeon.